board for the chapter, and we all welcome you for our second event. So moving on quickly to give you a brief of Cloud Security Alliance. There are the whole, it's a not-for-profit organization that's focused towards building security best practice for next generation, research and education programs, the cloud provider related certifications like the STAR, user certifications like the auditing knowledge and the CCSK, and it's a globally authoritative source for trust in cloud. There are 100 plus individual members, 300 plus corporate members, and 100 plus chapters around the world. The UAE chapter was formed in Jan 2021, earlier this year. Right after that, we've got a great traction in this region. We've got 300 plus individual members, our 6 board members that I have introduced. The key part about our community is the vision for us is to harness the cloud subject matter expertise of this region to offer cloud security specific research, education, certification, and events like these to benefit our community. We want to provide a forum through which diverse parties can work together and create and maintain a trusted cloud ecosystem. Our key objectives, especially for the year, this and then the forward year, are to focus on cloud security and areas that are specifically interested towards UAE and Middle East region. We want to provide a place where we have locally seeded research that can be vetted, explored without bias, supported, and published for the good of the community. Apart from these events, we also do have several research tracks running in parallel, and probably I'll give you more information about that at the end of our sessions. In terms of the timelines, we have 2 amazing energetic sessions upcoming. One would be right now that we will be introducing soon, and the second one would be 12 to 1. So our event is roughly for 2 hours. I want to introduce our first moderator, that's Hadi Anwar, who is our Director of Cloud Security Alliance and is the Group CIO of Group 42. So Hadi, over to you.
Thank you, Shivani, for that introduction regarding the group, our chapter, and myself. Let's get started. The first session is something very interesting for me. Talks about top threats to cloud computing, which obviously everybody is interested to hear about. So I'll start off with introducing our first speaker. His name is Varun Kukreja, who is a cybersecurity professional with over 14 years of experience and currently leads the cloud security portfolio under Protiviti Middle East Security and Privacy Practice. He has delivered more than 30 webinars in the last few years. Most of these were in 2020, which is last year, and during his work at IDC, where he led the Meta region's cybersecurity practice. During his role at IDC, he conducted many well-attended webinars on various topics, such as cloud security, red team engagements, and the likes of others. At his role in Protiviti, Varun leads critical engagements on cloud security, assisting clients across the Middle East to assess and improve their cloud security maturity through the implementation of cloud security frameworks and conducting in-depth risk and technical assessments and creating a multi-cloud security strategy. Apart from cloud security, Varun also focuses on niche areas within the cybersecurity arena, such as supply chain risk management, biomedical security, and DevSecOps, etc. In this presentation today, Varun will broadly cover how the traditional risk assessment approach needs to be changed to a tailor-made approach for the cloud environment. He will elaborate on how organizations should make changes to their risk management frameworks and inculcate a culture of cloud security awareness. As we are all aware that risk is a fundamental tool that organizations use to prioritize their investments and identify focus areas for improving security maturity, and hence it's critical for organizations to adapt this change now than later. Further, Varun will elaborate on how cloud security risks can be addressed using the Cloud Security Alliance report, Top Threats to Cloud Computing, Egregious 11. Varun will also share his experiences working with organizations all over the GCC on cloud security engagements, and would share an overall aspect, different trends of how UAE and GCC market is maturing in cloud security overall. I would like to request all of you to send your questions by typing them in the chat window, and these will be addressed at the end depending on how much time we have. On that point, on this note, I will hand the stage to Varun. Varun, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hadi, for that heartwarming welcome and that amazing introduction. Thank you so much. And of course, special thanks to this the CSA chapter into having me here and giving me the opportunity to speak to all of you today. I hope you're doing well, staying healthy, and your families back home are safe as well. So as Hadi mentioned, right, cloud has become kind of a pivotal pillar when it comes to digital transformation. And there is no digital transformation essentially happening without it, right? So in today's presentation, I want to start off with some of the macroeconomic trends that are really, changing the whole market within the Middle East. Just 1 second, I'm just taking control. All right. So during my work at IBC, we used to do a lot of market intelligence, right? We used to kind of go around, speak to CIOs and CISOs and understand what are their potential, changes that they're driving within their organization from an infrastructure perspective. Now, we all know that cloud was kind of a byproduct of the pandemic, and it kind of forced a lot of organizations to move into cloud because they had to change the way that they do business. Banks changed the way that they interact with the end customers. They created more and more applications. Digital banks were formed. Healthcare, on the other hand, completely transformed because regular people who needed medical attention had to revolve around how do you actually, interact with the end users. And that was seen across various industries. Now, cloud, as I mentioned, played a pivotal part in that overall transformation. So what happened is, what we saw kind of blew our mind, because in the next 3 years, the public cloud growth in the region is set to grow at a CAGR of 25%, from an estimated of around $936 million in 2021 to about $2.35 billion in 2024. So you can imagine the kind of growth that this region is witnessing when it comes to cloud. And with cloud comes the need of securing those initiatives as well, right? Now, there are 3 key initiatives and 3 key drivers that organizations are using to kind of go ahead and ensure that, that security is kind of a pivotal part of those cloud transformations as well. One is, of course, to kind of support the distributed workforce, right? We all, most of us still, are working from home. We are, I personally miss classroom sessions. Doing webinars has become a trend, but then there was a time where we used to do these sessions personally. And I hope to see that again one day. But because we are all working in a distributed manner, it's also kind of created a new challenge for organizations to ensure that the communications are secured, that people have more identity, lifecycle, and secured identity kind of baked in the way that we work and interact with those cloud services. The digital transformation initiative that organizations are doing, there's a huge need of ensuring that security is kind of baked in. We have learned our lessons from the past decade on upgrading our infrastructure, creating new applications. So we are trying our best from a CISO's perspective. They're trying their best to make sure that whatever digital transformation initiatives that they're running, they are ensuring that security is kind of baked in. And of course, cloud security overall is one of the top initiatives that organizations are really interested in. And that means rethinking security from a perspective of ensuring that cloud threats are not just identified, but threat at a much earlier stage than later. Now, of course, regulations are also catching up. What we are seeing is that across the GCC, Saudi Arabia has already released, cloud-specific frameworks. They're called by the NCA, National Communications Authority. And it's called the Cloud Control Compliance, which is CCC. And the best part about this compliance is that it's divided into the responsibilities that are expected from a CSP and the best practices that a CSP should also look at. What they've also done is also updated cloud security related controls within the SAMA framework as well. So banking industries where they are supposed to do this, they're also baking in some of those controls within the SAMA framework as well. And the same thing is also seen in Bahrain and Qatar, where Bahrain has created the IGA Cloud First policy, and Qatar has also created their cloud security policy. In UAE, we have the DESK CSP security framework, which completely focuses on the requirements that are expected from a CSP. And also the, NISA and ISRV2, both have been kind of updated to reflect some of the controls in cloud. And what we also understand is there's a cloud security policy also in the works, which should be released either later this year or early next year, which is aimed to provide guidelines to end organizations who are going to adopt cloud technologies within their infrastructure and technology stack, and how do they go about in ensuring what are the baseline controls that they should have in place from an IAS perspective. And ideally, what we're looking at is that it covers all 4 layers from a cloud infrastructure perspective. So infrastructure layer, the metastructure layer, the APPLI structure layer, and the infrastructure layer. So all 4 structures that you see from a CSA perspective ideally should be covered in these policies as well. Now, sorry, this just takes a second to change. All right. So when we speak to CIOs, and I personally, as Hadi was mentioning, I look at the cloud security portfolio. So that means I speak to a lot of CISOs and CIOs in the region who are going ahead with their cloud security transformations, and they're creating a multi-cloud roadmap within their organization. So some of the key things that I hear very often is lack of control, loss of visibility, and of course it comes with a huge fear of loss of data, right? But it's always about understanding their main concerns and also telling them what are the mitigation plans. See, cloud today is driven by business functions within an organization, and it is not a completely CIO-driven transformation as it was in the last 10 years. So what's happening is that there are CISOs who are really concerned about what happens if there's a loss of data. What happens if the cloud provider is really not able to delete all of my data? And that's a valid concern. And believe it or not, these are the same concerns which also transpires back into the Egregious 11 report that we'll go in depth soon. The other aspect is configuration issues and compromised APIs, because we give the control over to the CSP to look at what kind of configurations that they're going to put in from a hypervisor perspective, from an orchestration perspective, from a operating system perspective. So we have to make sure that are they doing the bare minimum, and are they utilizing the security guidelines to make sure that those configuration issues are addressed in time or not. Credentials compromise and account hijacking has really gone up in the last year as the byproduct of pandemic as well. As you might have known, and you have seen it within your organizations as well, that the number of phishing attacks really kind of shot out of the stratosphere in the last year, right? Now, because of that, that has resulted in a lot of credential compromise, because end users end up clicking those links, and has also led to a lot of ransomware related attacks. There are still concerns on vendor lock-ins and contractual issues. And personally, I've seen many contracts where the responsibilities are not appropriately documented. The data deletion is not appropriately documented as well. In fact, one of the recent risk assessment exercises I was doing, I realized that the SaaS provider does not delete your data upon exit. And what they want you to do is send them an email. And we found this after a lot of digging through their website, through their manuals. They have a small condition written into a contract that if you want to remove all your data, if you want to ensure permanent deletion, you have to send an email to so-and-so address. And believe it or not, we often miss those out, because when we are when we are transitioning from one application to the other, we overlook, what kind of data leakage that can happen from an archival perspective to the older SaaS provider. And that's a valid concern that still exists, believe it or not. And of course, the biggest problem that we have is that we do not have enough cloud security resources in the region. And as this, the speed of transformation is not able to catch up with the cloud security resources that we have in the region. And I hope that this changes sometime soon. And with the help of this chapter, more and more people become aware of cloud security and how to get there, how to do their certifications, especially the CCSK, which I believe is a fantastic start for a certification in cloud security. Now, right? Yeah. So when we talk about the Egregious 11, I'm not sure how many of you have got the chance to review this fantastic report. It was published by CSA early this year, and it talks about the top 11 threats that exist in cloud security even today. Now, there are some new entrants in this threat, in this report, and there are some that have retained the positions from last year. So, for example, vendor lock-in used to be one of the top threats in 2020 and 2019. However, that doesn't exist now because more and more CSPs are learning from their older mistakes and ensuring that those kind of lock-ins and those contractual conditions are taken care of when new contracts are formed. So what we'll do now is we'll go through each and every one of these threats, and we'll cover two main areas. We'll cover why these still happen. And that's an important aspect to understand because there's more to it than we see on the outside. And then we also kind of cover what are the recommendations from a best practices perspective of how you can actually mitigate those risks. We also have some anecdotes and examples that we can go through and see how that have actually resulted in an impact for an organization, which has resulted in devastating results at times. Now, number one, data breaches. This is not a surprise, right? Data breaches is something that we've talked about for the last 5 years. With the onset of GDPR, we see a lot of organizations being fined incredible amount of penalties which are levied on them from perspective of leakage of private data. And of course, it also comes with an irreversible damage to the reputation of the organization, right? It is important to note that this point retains the number one position in the list of threats in cloud environment. So it was the top threat last year, and it remains the top threat this year as well, right? So why does it happen? Why do data breaches still happen? It happens because organizations don't understand or document the list of segregation of responsibilities. I've seen many contracts, and when I asked about the ratio matrix, for example, dividing the responsibilities of what the CSP is supposed to do and what the CSC is supposed to do, they were lost. I have not seen those clueless faces in a long time, which I saw then, because they never think about it, right? When you get a contract, you're in so much hurry to kind of go and start working and start deploying your applications into the cloud environment. You don't think about who is doing what, right? But when it comes to long-term contracts with cloud providers, it is extremely important to make sure that you document the segregation of responsibilities into ensuring that the CSP understands the responsibilities and also the CSC understands the responsibilities. So as consumers, it is extremely important for you to understand and draw that line of what you are supposed to do and what the CSP is supposed to do. The low cloud security skills in the region, of course, adds more to this. What's happening in most organizations is that they are learning on the go. As they are onboarding more IaaS and PaaS-based solutions within their organizations, they are also learning with respect to the trainings that they get from the cloud providers. I was assessing this particular client's O365 application, and it's a sensitive organization, but they've adopted Office 365. But during our findings, we pointed out that since each and every user has got an O365 account, each one has a 1 terabyte of a OneDrive cloud storage as well. Now I can potentially save my data there and just email that link to anyone else outside the organization. And this needs to be fixed. And they came back saying that, we have to upgrade our license. We don't have the budgets to do it. And I was like, no, a simple Google research will tell you that there's just a tick mark that needs to happen so that any data outside your domain doesn't get shared. And therein lies the problem, right? Organizations are not taking the time to kind of build their cloud security skills, to have somebody who's responsible from a cloud security perspective, and also train those people in an appropriate manner. The third problem that is happening is that they are deploying now and security is later. Because of the onset of the pandemic last year, organizations started forcing, the businesses started forcing the technology departments to kind of go on and deploy as much as applications as possible into cloud. But they did not think about security. They always thought, let's deploy now, security will come later, just like it has always happened in the past. And that obviously leads to gaps in a longer term. Low regulation and framework adoption is also one of the reasons, because as you've seen in the slide before this, countries are catching up. They're doing their best. They're creating those policies. They're creating those frameworks, but it's going to take some time. But that doesn't mean that you can't do anything about it. The recommendations that I have here. So, for example, for regulation and framework, the best place to start is the CSA-CCM. Fantastic cloud security framework. You can embed it very well within your ISO 27001 framework. Even if you don't have it, you can use that as a baseline framework to start your cloud security journey. Do a business impact analysis of what can actually happen if you lose the data. Do you have any statutory regulations? Do you have any penalty clauses on you as an organization? And once you know that, you understand what kind of data you need to protect, what kind of controls you need to have so that you can actually create controls around protection of that data. Creating a data access register formation will help you understand who has access to what data and whether that person really needs it. Oftentimes in our reviews, we find out that a certain department has access to this particular data, which it should not, right? We have been doing it in our on-premise environment. So why do we forget to do it when it comes to cloud? Ensuring that data at rest, data in motion, data in use and encrypted, but it's a careful balance that needs to be achieved here, because if you overdo encryption, you will have performance issues, right? So it is important to understand what kind of data is in use or what kind of data is in rest at the cloud premises, and whether they are providing you any kind of encryption services that you can ensure and make sure that that data remains encrypted and out of prying eyes, especially of external users. Have a data governance strategy. Now, what I mean by a data governance strategy is create a roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years on the things you want to achieve when it comes to data security. Right? It starts with identification of what kind of regulations you are levied upon, and then ensuring and identifying technologies that you can actually use to fill this gap. This starts with doing activities like data classification, using data classified tools to ensure whatever data your end users are creating is classified at the moment it's created. It then goes on to implement data leakage prevention solutions, and then go on for to a level where you can even have IRM solutions, right? Where you have information rights management. So any data that is going outside the purview of your organization, you still retain full control on where the data is going. And finally, try to shift from a qualitative-based risk assessment to a more quantitative-based risk assessment. We've seen that organizations are moving to a quantitative risk assessment because, one, they want to identify what could be a potential dollar value loss when it comes to the risks that exist in cloud. And second, it obviously helps you get more funding from management, because cloud has taken a lot of budgets from the organizations, right? But the moment you go back to management and you showcase what kind of losses that could potentially happen, they usually agree and they give you the budget for it. And the third thing, of course, is if you plan to go for cyber insurance, this is a fantastic tool, because you exactly know the kind of stuff that you potentially can lose if there is a potential attack. And cyber insurance will help you quantify that as well. Now, moving on, misconfigurations and inadequate change control is the new top threat that has come up in this particular year, right? Now, there's a wide gap between the way that we used to traditionally manage the data center and cloud, right? The technology is different, the skill set is different, and there's also lack of control on the cloud resources as well. As you move up the chain from an IaaS perspective to a SaaS perspective, you have lesser and lesser control, and you're more dependent on the CSP itself. Now, what is the guarantee that the CSP is actually making sure that all the baselines and all the configurations are appropriately mentioned there? But that usually does not always happen. So CSPs actually lack the mastering of change management. They are not in that position yet where they've really mastered this change management solution, and they're still also learning as they go. So maintaining the consistent baseline has become a very big challenge for cloud security providers. This is where we come in and make sure that whatever we can do from a consumer's perspective, so that starts with documenting your responsibilities as a CSC and reviewing the SOC 2 Type 2 report of your CSP as well. There are also solutions which you can use, such as a CSPM, which is the Cloud Security Posture Management solution, which helps you consistently monitor the changes in your configuration within the cloud environment. And then finally, also try and assess your supply chain. As we rely on a distributed working model, and as we grow within this cloud environment, we give control to more and more contractors that we tend to work with, contractors, third parties. And now third parties are actually becoming fourth parties and fifth parties. So it is important to identify and assess your supply chain as well, because one of the weakest link within your supply chain can cause a massive havoc within your organization. Lack of cloud security architecture and strategy is a fascinating point, right? As we mentioned before, organizations are still at a mindset of deploy now and think about security later. So lift and shift now, think later. But what's happening is that because they will eventually move to a multi-cloud environment, they're not thinking about security from the get-go, right? So the cloud security strategy that you have in place is misaligned with the business goals. If your business goals are more towards ensuring privacy of end users, ensuring that data is secured at all times, that strategy is completely misaligned as of now. So what organizations need to do is to have a strategy and match that migration strategy with the business goals and objectives. So if your goal, if one of your business goals is to ensure privacy of your end users and of your customers, you have to also make sure that you have respective controls in place in the cloud environment. But when you're creating that strategy, there are 3 to 4 key things to keep in mind. One is that you create a maturity scale. Now, what that means is that it's more like a CMMI level 1 to 5 maturity model, where you start with level 1 and all the way to level 5, right? So you identify what are the key things that you need to achieve and do a current state assessment. When you do a current state assessment, you understand where you currently lie on that maturity scale. You could be 2 out of 5, you could be 5 out of 5, but be honest with you, right? And try to understand what are the key initiatives that you need to take up in the next 3 to 5 years to get to a level 5. And when you do threat modeling, you kind of understand what are the threat vectors that exist in my current cloud framework and how do I ensure that I stop those vectors from becoming a reality. You understand and identify regulatory frameworks that exist today and can potentially exist on me tomorrow. Now, as an example, UAE has just announced a privacy framework that is going to come up in the next, probably 2 to 3 months. Now, that means that a lot of organizations are going to be subjected to privacy as well. Now, had they planned for privacy baked into their cloud environment, they would not be worried. But most organizations today will be worried because 6 months down the line, they have to make sure that they are aligned with the privacy objectives that the UAE government is releasing on them. And most of all, it is really important to have continuous monitoring in the cloud environment. It's not as easy as it sounds, because soft maturity itself in this region is currently at a very low level. So what organizations need to do is to have have baseline requirements when you assess a CSP. Make sure that they give you the logs, or that they provide you the monitoring services, so that you know if something is going wrong, you can know in near real time and take actions to kind of prevent those incidents on becoming realized. Now, insufficient.
Well, I'm sorry, just to interrupt you. Apologize for that.
Sure.
In the interest of time, we need to move a bit quicker.
Sure.
I want to stop at 11:50, so we can have at least 10 minutes for the question and answers.
Absolutely. Noted.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. So identity and access management is still a problem. Most of organizations don't realize that they have the capability to use SAML integrations with their AD integrations as well, and they kind of rely on whatever whatever identity and access management solutions that they are bringing in. What organizations also don't realize is that multi-factor authentication requirements are also kind of baked in. The third thing I've seen recently in the region is that there's a big gap between the on-premise policy of the organization and what exists in the cloud. So for example, one of the assessments that I was doing, we realized that the screen timeout for the SaaS applications should be around 5 minutes, but on various applications, it varied between 15 to 30 minutes. And that session timeout is an extremely important factor when it comes to a clean desk and clear screen policy, which still does not exist. Now, account hijacking, account hijacking is still a plague that we are subjected to, because the number of phishing attacks, the number of targeted and persistent attacks have really increased. The second thing that is really plaguing account hijacking is the reliance on the third, fourth, and fifth parties that I was talking about. With the recent exercise that I was doing, we realized that the third, fourth, and fifth parties were to be assessed, and the fourth party turned out to be the weakest chain. The USBs were active, and definitely not a good security hygiene controls in place. So if that fourth party gets compromised, the entire network can be compromised as well. So it's important to kind of ensure that you do an assessment on your third, fourth, and fifth parties as well. Employ user behavior analytics tools, because they are really maturing as technology moves at the speed of light as well. So they are ensuring that they're using artificial intelligence to kind of find out how well they can understand and predict the user behavior, so that they can stop attacks from happening and learn on the TTPs, right? So when you modify your security awareness program, make sure that you kind of cover the new tactics, techniques, and procedures that hackers are using, especially in the cloud environment. Take a few examples of the recent attacks that have happened in cloud and targeted phishing attacks, which have led to a huge amount of compromise within organizations. Now, insider threat still exists, but it's not as simple anymore. It is just not about a disgruntled employee anymore. It is about an unaware employee. It is an espionage that can happen from a contractor, right? It's really become much bigger because of the dependence on the distributed workforce itself. So what do we need to do? We need to ensure that we protect the crown jewels, such as customer information and privacy-related information of our customers, and make sure that access that is given to those people who have, which we talked about in the first slide as well, is on a need-to-know basis. If you have the technology for security awareness, try to pinpoint where an insider negligence can happen, and make sure that you go back to those users and make them aware once more. Just in cognizant of the time. Insecure interfaces and API. This is a point that I really want to talk about a little bit. Now, you would be wondering why in 2021 interfaces and APIs are still a thing. We've been talking about secure source code practices for so long, but still in 2021, we are still talking about insecure interfaces. So I want to point you to the OWASP Top 10 report, And I want to remind you that since 2013, this report comes every 4 years, right? So there's 2013, 17, and 21. Injection still remains number 1 point. So if you've not been able to fix injection related issues for the past 10 years, the insecure interfaces and APIs will also remain the same kind of importance. It will retain that importance for the next 5 to 7 years as well, unless we ensure that not all APIs, and we understand that not all APIs are created equally, right? We need to reduce our reliance on open source APIs and create custom APIs and test them before releasing it into production, right? Use APIs from trusted resources, use developers that understand security before releasing those APIs into our production environment. Now, the control plane, for those who don't know, is the orchestration layer, which is used by IaaS and PaaS deployment models and the CSPs to kind of make sure that whatever security controls or integrity related controls kind of are baked in. Now, this becomes a problem because organizations and the administrators do not really understand the architectural related requirements or the administration related requirements. So they do not have the entire view of how the cloud is designed, so that they rely on whatever they've learned in the training or whatever they see in the manuals, and they often lead to misconfigurations. So what organizations should do is to review the existing cloud infrastructure. By doing that, you would be able to understand how your landing zone is designed, whether it's appropriate, and whether it meets the baseline practices or not. Understand your legal and statutory obligations, and wherever applicable, understand the responsibility of the control plane. The worst scenario that you can lead into is come to a point where you are not controlling the control plane and neither is the CSP. Okay. Metastructure and APPLI structure. So as you would know, CSA has defined 4 key layers when it comes to cloud. There is the infrastructure, which is basically managed by the cloud service provider. Then you have the metastructure, which is basically the orchestration layer. Then you have the APPLI structure, which is like PaaS, because all the applications are deployed there, and the infrastructure, which has all the data within the cloud environment. Now, what happens here is because a lot of organizations do not understand the implementation requirement of the metastructure by the CSP itself and the administrator, the cloud administrator, this leads to a lot of issues when it comes to visibility and security and privacy within the cloud environment. So what organizations need to do is review the SOC 2 Type 2 report. So this will give you a visibility into the security practices that are followed by the cloud service provider and ensure that whether he's actually doing his best to fix those infrastructure, metastructure issues or not. Now, limited cloud visibility is actually divided into 2 main challenges. One, you have unsanctioned app usage, which is essentially shadow IT, right? Where you don't know what are the cloud services which your end users are using. The second challenge is sanctioned app usage, which is where you don't know how often they are using the applications. You don't know what is the usage analytics and whether it's actually giving the business value back to the end users or not, right? Which is where comes in the CSA-CCM. The CSA-CCM will help you ensure and kind of strengthen your foundation for the cloud security governance and have various policies and procedures in place. And what is also recommended here is having a doer check-in mechanism for commissioning and decommissioning on virtual environments. Because by doing that, you would also have a control on the cost. Believe it or not, cost can really spiral out of control in a cloud environment if not kept under a tight lid. The last point is abuse of cloud services. More and more hackers today are relying on the incredible elasticity of cloud and to, okay, so this is a question I'll address later. The elasticity of the cloud to carry out DDoS attacks, crypto mining-led attacks, and brute force attacks. What organizations should do, as I mentioned before, is have consistent monitoring of the cloud environment, have an instant response framework that you can update for your cloud services, and have technologies like DLP, to ensure that you have a strong data governance framework in place, and do health monitoring of your cloud services. This brings us to a penultimate point in our presentation. What you need to do is reform your risk management. What is important to understand here is that we cannot rely on the same mechanism that we use traditionally for risk management. So how did we do risk management before? We used to do VAPT, we used to do internal audits, and then we would do risk meetings once in 6 months, right, to understand what are the new risks. That doesn't work in the cloud environment anymore. So what I would urge you, if you take anything from this presentation, take this: reform your risk management. So start with creating a cloud security vendor assessment checklist. Now this checklist is your go-to checklist when it comes to assessing how mature the CSP is, right? Whether he understands, whether he provides SOC 2 Type 2 reports, whether does he have any particular contractual requirements, and which could potentially lead you into a vendor lock-in kind of a scenario. And then create a threat profile of that cloud service in question, which will help you identify whether there is a particular vector which an attacker can utilize at a later point to compromise my data. Start with reviewing the contractual terms of existing cloud services to understand what kind of risks that exist for the cloud services that you've already gone forward with, and assess the potential impact from your existing supply chain. The fourth and fifth thing that you need to do is assess the identity and access controls and the data flow assessment. Please remember, the two things that you will always be responsible for is identity and data. No matter which line of deployment model you go with, especially more and more organizations go with SaaS, but these two always remain your responsibility. Now, to summarize, there are 6 key points that I want to drive home with you. Is start with adopting a cloud security framework. If you don't have a statutory or regulatory framework in place, I would suggest to start with the CSA-CCM, which is the Cloud Security Alliance's own security framework called Cloud Controls Matrix. There's a recent version 4.1, which I think just came out recently. It's a fantastic framework to start with. It works well with your ISO 27001 program as well. Reform your risk management approach. The traditional risk management approach may not be worthwhile. Try to segregate and ensure that you document the roles and responsibilities between you as the consumer and the CSP. Make sure that you adopt best practices for identity and access management in a more holistic manner, which can be scalable to all of your cloud services. Create a cloud security strategy which is more in line with the business objectives, and it aligns perfectly well with your multi-cloud strategy as well. And finally, a robust data governance and security framework will go a long way in your multi-cloud journey. Well, with that, thank you so much for being a patient audience. Hadi, over to you.
Thank you, Varun, for a very informative session and a brilliant presentation. A few of the guys have asked a question if the presentation would be shared. We will definitely share this presentation with all the attendees. Now, I have received a lot of questions. Some we can all read on the chat window, and some have only been sent to me. So I'll request you, Varun, to be very quick in answering the questions. Let's make it a rapid fire kind of a session.
Sure.
So we can try and cover as many questions as we can, as we only have around 10 to 11 minutes. So the first question is, nowadays, a lot of software that we use has a cloud storage associated with it, which is probably managed by a third party, which is another third party. How can we ensure that a software that we use in our environment, which has a cloud contract with another third party, where the software stores or processes our data, deletes the data as per the contract with the primary software vendor? So like a back-to-back kind of arrangement.
Yeah.
Out of so
that's a great question. What many cloud vendors don't tell you is that it is almost impossible to delete your data, because they use SSDs, and how they basically delete your data is by crypto shredding. So they delete your data, with a key. So they encrypt your data with a key, and then the key that comes out, they encrypt that key again. And the final key that comes out, they just kind of destroy it. So it's not that your data gets deleted. It's just that it's double encrypted. But what most of the organizations under GDPR rule are supposed to do is they have a specific email address. And the best we can do as consumers is go back to them and request them for data deletion and get the confirmation from them. Unfortunately, that's the best we can do. But for the other aspect of the data usage, I would suggest they often come under the shadow IT environment. I would suggest you speak to your business users and try to understand the data flow, how it is created till the time it's archived, and make sure that you have your contractual obligations in place.
Thank you, Varun, for that answer. The next question is related to the hot topic of data privacy. And the question is, if you could kindly elaborate on the key challenges to privacy in a cloud environment that customers are facing within the region.
That's actually a good question. Now, most organizations, the biggest problem that they're facing right now is to let users know and get their buy-in of how their data is actually being used. That becomes the number one problem, because you have to modify your websites, you have to modify your paper trail, and you have to get buy-in on all the cookies, everything that you have. And the worst part is having a database that kind of makes sure that everything is kind of put there, right? So for example, if a user says, please don't use my data for mass emailers, and he gets a mass email, well, you're in trouble, right? And that's the biggest problem that organizations are facing. Thankfully, technologies today exist that can actually address this problem. But that becomes a very big headache for organizations to manage, because it's almost impossible to keep a database of thousands and thousands of end users to see who wants to be part of the mass communication and who doesn't. The second biggest problem is the penalties that come with the responsibility of data privacy. Whether organizations like it or not, past year or so, we have officially entered into the privacy era. And this will only get better from here, which is good, because we are leaving a better world for our kids. We are creating a better privacy-aware world for our kids. And that becomes the number two challenge. Organizations can often be crippled by the huge amount of penalties that can be levied on them.
Thank you, Varun. Next question is security a major hindrance to cloud adoption in this region? And if you could please share your thoughts on this.
That's an amazing question. Security, I would never say it's been a hindrance, but it's more of a business enabler. But see, it entirely depends on the CISO or the security manager or the CIO. It's always about achieving that fine balance of productivity without sacrificing security, which can always be done, but that's a headache of a job. And that's where we as security professionals come in and make sure that we keep the businesses happy while making sure that they remain secure.
Thank you, Varun. I also think, I feel, and that's my personal opinion to answer this question about security, because it's something very close to my heart. I feel that I think some of the cloud security providers, the controls they bring in are much of a higher level than our own controls deployed. So I think they offer much more security and more of in this region, the discussion is of data residency, localization, who's got what control, etc., etc. And that is something, it's a bigger discussion to have. Next question, if you could kindly elaborate on the practical steps to implement DevSecOps in the cloud, something very high level, please.
That's a longer discussion. However, if you have DevOps in place, it's all about understanding your CI and CD cycle, how you do continuous integration and continuous development, and how you actually plug in security in each of your steps. So it depends on what kind of agile methodology you're following, how is your development cycle, and then kind of plugging in with help of solutions and processes to kind of come into various aspects and make sure that you transform into DevOps to a DevSecOps. But yeah, it's a much longer discussion, because each organization has a different life cycle that they're following, different kind of processes that they follow, different type of cloud environments. So it's kind of customized and tailor-made for organization to organization.
Thank you, Varun. Next question. I think we're doing well so far with our pace. Do we need a vendor assessment checklist when dealing with leaders such as Microsoft, Amazon, Googles of the world?
Absolutely. See, I mean, I agree to you, Hari, what you said. They do come up with a much higher level of security technology stack and the best practices that they follow as well, right? Which gives us a certain amount of comfort. However, there are certain things that you need to make sure that are in place for you, for your organization, which should be considered before you take the decision. Now, as an example, if AWS does not have a data center in UAE and you have a resiliency requirement on you, it's not a good match. You have to look at some other vendor because you have to comply with local guidelines. So it is always better to create a vendor assessment checklist for you, for your requirements, to make sure that whether it's a make or a break deal, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable and what is manageable.
Thank you, Varun. Next question, moving swiftly on, is how do you handle conflicting data privacy regulatory requirements or laws on the cloud across different countries, especially for multinational organizations who are present, across different territories, etc.?
So it's a much longer discussion. However, so I'll take this a particular example of a client that I'm working with in Saudi. And this bank is present in more than 50 countries across the world. And what we are, they have the similar problem. They have multiple cloud vendors that exist in countries which are not as part of the countries that they operate in, right? So we are kind of having discussions with them in understanding which are the countries that they operate in, what are the privacy guidelines there, and whether those privacy guidelines are matched by your cloud security providers or not, and identifying what is the gap that exists between these two aspects, and then working on identifying action plans that can be implemented to ensure that those regulatory guidelines are satisfied. That also might mean that you may have to shift from one particular cloud vendor, which might be doing a good job for you, to a local cloud vendor, which may not do a good job. So that is the reason why I said that you should start with the cloud security strategy and identify the regulatory requirements first, and then move on to identifying your cloud vendors. Because if you do the other way around, if you do lift and shift, and if you come under the business pressure and move first, that leads you into a problem.
Okay, we've just received another question fresh from the oven. And the question is, how do you ensure that your data resides in the local data center of your cloud service provider?
It's usually in the contractual terms. When you're having those discussions with the cloud vendor, make sure that this is one of the questions that they answer. So it goes back to your cloud security checklist, right? So some of the things that you should be asking, whether whether you provide a SOC 2 type to report, whether you are compliant on CSA Star, which is an amazing cloud security certification that cloud vendors should have, whether you provide SAML integration for my Active Directory, for automating my identity and access management, whether you provide what kind of data encryption do you provide, whether you provide encryption standards that are widely accepted, or you provide encryption standards that are only acceptable by you. So these are the questions that you should be asking in your vendor assessment checklist. And when you do that, you decide parameters which you find acceptable or non-acceptable.
Yep, I totally agree with you, Varun, there. I think that links back to the checklist question. We need to have a set of questions ready.
Absolutely.
And if you're talking about checklist, I think the CCA framework is a good place to start. So
Absolutely.
go through that framework, which we have developed as part of the CSA. Last question. Let's take the last one. Do I need a separate risk assessment methodology to be defined for my cloud environment?
No, you do not. All you need is an addition to your existing risk assessment methodology if you do, because there's no point in creating a different risk assessment methodology or creating a different risk register. What you can create is something that complements your existing risk methodology, right? Your overall approach would remain the same. You would still end up accepting the risk or rejecting the risk or mitigating the risk, but the way you identify risk kind of changes, right? So one parameter of risk assessment, which is identification of risk, is what changes. Rest of it remains the same, because you would still have risk mitigation in place, you would still have residual risk, and you would still have a continuous risk assessment cycle. But the only thing that kind of changes and needs to change is the identification of the risks.
Okay, thank you for that, Varun. And we have a second very interesting session lined up straight away. So I will pass the mic on to Shivani to take the stage and maybe introduce the next moderator and the speaker.
Thank you so much, Adi. Pleasure being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Varun, for a very interesting talk, especially the whole aspect about the policies which is specific to the region. That was interesting to that you brought about. Thank you, Adi, for moderating the event. Now moving on to our next event,